Hi, and welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet, a weekly program providing you with the latest information, resources, services, and community efforts taking place locally here in the Bronx and virtually. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne. Coming up, advocates in New York have raised concerns about the surge of stop and frisk across the city. A senior staff attorney for the New York Civil Liberties Union joins me to discuss the history of this discriminatory practice. Why is the NYPD slowly adopting stop and frisk tactics? Then the short film Veintitires, Our Labor Saved Lives documents the Latin immigrants who fought for pandemic relief. The director, producer, and editor of the film joins me to discuss the documentary and its triumphant victory. What was the inspiration behind Veintitires, Our Labor Saved Lives? After that, we're going to take a look at some of our wonderful BronxNet packages. And finally, an Iowa teen must now pay $150,000 in restitution after killing her abuser. The executive director of the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault joins me to discuss this ruling. How will this impact survivors of sexual assault? So please stick around. Open BxRx Tuesday starts now. Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. The mayor's effort to remove illegal guns off the streets may be the cause of the rise in stop and frisk. Stop and frisk is the act of searching random people and suspects on the street for weapons or illegal substances. Known as a discriminatory practice, many advocates are voicing their concerns. Joining me to discuss stop and frisk and what this could mean for the people of New York is the senior staff attorney for the New York Civil Liberties Union, Daniel Lambright. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I talked a little bit about stop and frisk, but can you tell us a little bit more about this act in general and, what was stop and frisk designed to do?
So to back up, in New York, officers can stop people on the street if they have founded suspicion that the person is engaged in criminal activity. At that point, they can frisk somebody if they have a reasonable suspicion that that individual is carrying a weapon or is dangerous to other people or the officer themselves. So in that case, the frisk is supposed to be protective, primarily for the officer, such that the officer doesn't get harmed. The stop and frisk program, the stated purpose was to get guns off the street, which it failed to do. In reality, it's functioned as a method of socially controlling Black and brown men. And here's what I mean by this. When he was a state senator, current Mayor Adams stated that the police commissioner at the time, Ray Kelly, informed him that the NYPD's stop and frisk program targeted and focused on Black men and Latino men because Ray Kelly wanted to instill fear in them that every time that they left their homes, they would be targeted by police.
Well, I'm really glad that you kind of gave us a little bit of background on that. Can you talk a little bit more about the history of stop and frisk? When did this actually begin? And I understand that, people are getting more concerned about it. So was it banned at any point? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so protective frisk have been around since the Supreme Court's decision in Terry. But in 1999, after the murder of Amadou Diallo, the New York AG's office did an investigation into the NYPD. And the AG found that the NYPD was stopping and frisking Black and Latino men disproportionate to their involvement in any crimes. And this led to a lawsuit, Daniels v. City of New York, which the city agreed to institute a policy that they wouldn't conduct certain stops and frisks based on race. And there were data monitoring and reporting requirements. However, in the mid 2000s, it became apparent through leaked statements and reporting that the NYPD was still engaging in policy and practice of mass stopping Black and brown men and frisking them based on race without individualized suspicion. And from 2004 to 2012, NYPD officers made 4.4 million stops that resulted in people being frisked by police officers. And although Black people constituted less than a quarter of New York City's population, they made up half of the people who were stopped by officers in that time period. And in 2013, after litigation from a few city civil rights groups, a federal court found that NYPD's stop and frisk practices were unconstitutional and amounted to intentional discrimination in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and the 4th Amendment.
Now, I understand that your organization also had, a hand in getting rid of stop and frisk, or just, reducing the number of stops. Can you tell us a little bit more about that effort?
Right. So around that time period, there were 3 lawsuits filed against the NYPD's stop and frisk practices. The first one was Floyd, which challenged NYPD's stop and frisk practices citywide. The second one was Davis, which challenged NYPD stop and frisk practices at NYCHA buildings. And the third one, brought by my organization, NYCLU, and Bronx Defenders, as well as Latino Justice, was focused on buildings that were privately owned buildings that were enrolled in this program known as the Trespass Affidavit Program, TAP. That program is no longer in existence. The police department ended it recently, I think in part because of this lawsuit. And Floyd went to trial. The city lost, and the city also agreed to settle Davis and Ligon. And all of this litigation resulted in a requirement that the NYPD end the kind of mass stops and frisk of Black and brown men without individualized suspicion. Additionally, a federal monitor was appointed and to oversee the NYPD and to make sure that the NYPD come in compliance with the Constitution. And this is kind of what didn't happen after Daniels, and what is supposed to ensure that the NYPD doesn't go back to those same practices that the court found unconstitutional in the Floyd decision.
Well, as I mentioned, your organization, as well as many other advocates, are voicing their concerns because we are seeing, a rise in stop and frisk. Why do you think under Mayor Adams, the NYPD is slowly going back to stop and frisk tactics?
So I think there's a myth that crime is at an astronomical level and that the subways and the streets are unsafe. This is not true. While there's been an uptick in crime is nowhere near the levels of the 1970s or the 1980s or the 1990s or even the early 2000s. However, because of few tragic and sensationalized stories and the perception that crime is at an all-time high, politicians like Mayor Adams, who kind of ran on this public safety message, are leaning on failed tough on crime policies and rhetoric. And in reality, this is kind of a piece of political theater that won't make anybody safer, but will have disastrous effects on the lives of brown and Black young men of color.
Now, the number of stops and frisks has risen tremendously, with over 4,000 stops in the second quarter of 2022, surpassing any 3-month period since 2015. We're seeing this as the city makes an effort to remove guns from the streets, but according to the Center for Constitutional Rights, only 7% of arrests made recovered guns. Is there any reason why you think we're seeing such low numbers for recovered guns, especially since that's the entire reason why we're seeing this uptick in stop and frisk?
Well, I think it's just a signal that the program doesn't work, that it's based on stereotypes as to who's carrying guns. This is exactly what was found in the previous regime of stop and frisk, where about, I think, 2% or less of frisk resulted in the actual recovery of a weapon. And when actually the fascinating part of the data is that when white people were stopped and frisked, officers were more likely to recover a weapon than when black and brown men were stopped and frisked. So this shows really that beyond the kind of ethical, moral, and constitutional problems of mass stopping people based on race, it's just a really ineffective crime fighting effort.
Now, can you talk about the lasting effects, like for the people who have been stopped and were innocent? Was this on their record? Did this follow them around? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's several lasting kind of effects of stop and frisk. Police encounters may increase the risk of individuals getting future felonies. So, for example, the NYPD was using reports generated from stop and frisk that were supposed to be sealed to investigate people. And this is what the Bronx defenders brought a lawsuit about in 2018 or 2019. And additionally, because the focus of the stop and frisk regime was on young men of color, it meant that many school-age children were stopped and frisked by police. They were pushed up against walls and frisked, as former Mayor Bloomberg endorsed. And there's studies suggesting that those students, those young black and brown men, experience adverse consequences in education as a result of being stopped and frisked. So higher dropout rates, poorer performance in school based on their experiences with the NYPD. Additionally, there's just the harm of being excluded from the public space, the fear of people unable to go out in public without being harassed by police, and the additional fears and problems being marked as a criminal based solely on race and ethnicity.
Now we're, nearing the end of our segment. Can you just let everybody know what they can do to stay updated about this? And, how can New Yorkers remain vigilant regarding stop and frisk?
So there are a few ways. I think you can continue to kind of come to our site, the New York Civil Liberties Union's website. We give reports. We publish reports about it. Additionally, there's, like I said before, we're in a federal monitorship. You can go and read the federal monitors reports at nypdmonitor.org. You can also attempt to contact the federal monitor. You can also attempt to contact the NYCLU if you believe that officers are engaging in widespread stop and frisk practices. These are all of the ways that you can stay informed and you can stay active about what's going on. Reach out, as the NYP likes to say, if you see something, say something.
All right, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday. Welcome back. What started out as an exhibit highlighting the Latin experience with immigration and a pandemic has now become a short documentary. Veintitires, Our Labor Saved Lives focuses on the 23-day hunger strike that led to $2.1 billion in relief for excluded workers. Let's take a quick look at the trailer.
Porque no venimos a pedir regalado, venimos a trabajar. Nuestro trabajo de toda la gente que estamos inmigrantes, tanto como yo, vendedora, como los que trabajan en casa, como los que trabajan de lavandería, pintando uñas, los que trabajan de delivery. Aún así estamos aquí nosotros, pero nuestros compañeros, nuestro pueblo inmigrante está trabajando afuera. Y no se unen a uno a veces por miedo, pero aquí estamos los que no tenemos miedo y estamos por ello. Estamos aquí todos mis compañeros sin comer, mientras que usted va a estar con su familia comiendo rico, ustedes comiendo rico, mientras que nosotros comemos ¿qué? Dolor de estómago, dolor de cabeza, dolor de hueso. No es justo, así que queremos justicia para todos.
Director, producer, and editor of the film, Djali Brown-Cepeda, joins me to discuss this project. Djali, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we spoke a few times, and I understand the last time we spoke, you were telling us about the exhibit with MoMA PS1 titled Nuevayorkinos, Essential and Excluded. For those who don't know, can you talk a little bit about that journey and how it led to this?
Yeah, so Nuevayorkinos, Essential and Excluded, that happened last fall to this early winter. And it was a multimedia project that centered the 23-day hunger strike that undocumented workers and allies alike in New York City, Westchester, throughout the state underwent to make sure that undocumented folk received adequate COVID relief in terms of, monetary assistance. And so for the show itself, there was photos that were taken for the exhibit, photos that were taken before the exhibit. There were different parts of protest art. So from the pots and pans to the different signs. We created a living room space in the middle for folks to, sit and contemplate. And part of this exhibit was also Veintitires. It was the film, but I was able to kind of finesse it a bit more after the exhibit was done.
Now, I really want to talk about that. That sounds just so amazing. And it's so great to see your work continuing to expand and go on to other things. Can you just talk about the ways the project, expanded from the exhibit into, a short film, kind of like a standalone short film?
Yeah, so I wanted to do something where I was able to further use the tools that I have to help, memorialize this story. And I was very humbled and very honored that the people who underwent this hunger strike and some of the people who organized this hunger strike, one of the co-organizers I became very close with, and she trusted me to tell this story. And so the film actually played a bit at the end of our show in January, but it didn't have its premiere its New York City premiere formally until a couple weeks ago. But it has played throughout the country in a few different film festivals, which was really dope, for lack of a better word, and I wasn't expecting it. But I just felt that there should be something aside from photos, aside from this beautiful protest art, and aside from this incredible show that I had the opportunity to do, but something that, folks can always go back to, and something that the hunger strikers themselves or the organizers themselves can play, for the hunger strikers, can play for their kids. So, I wanted to create something that was a little bit longer lasting.
I love that you mentioned that, because I always think of any sort of media as something that is just lasting forever, right? So 10 years from now, people can watch this and kind of understand what people were going through during that time. So I love that you brought that up. I want to talk a little bit about the inspiration behind the title, Veintitires, Our Labor Saved Lives. Can you tell us, why you decided to go with that? I want to add that already I'm learning a lot. So I think it's an amazing title. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Veintitires is 23 in Spanish, and the hunger strike was a 23-day hunger strike, and the film is roughly 23 minutes. And their labor saved lives. Undocumented labor saves lives all the time throughout the pandemic. That's the first time that you're hearing of the words, essential workers, but undocumented workers, immigrant workers, Black, brown labor, like this has already been essential since 1492, so and since the onslaught of transatlantic slave trade and colonization, like our labor has always saved lives. And so I wanted to, and in this particular moment, people who already don't have, or people who already didn't have much, were further putting themselves into a position where they weren't eating, where they weren't drinking, or they were drinking water, but they weren't eating anything substantial, and their bodies were literally decaying. And so our labor saved lives, meaning that from their labor of this 23-day hunger strike, they ended up being able to pass this monumental $2.1 billion fund that in turn saved lives, So by them putting their lives on the line for 23 días, for 23 days, they were able to, do something really remarkable for all of immigrant and undocumented New York.
Now, in the film, we actually get to hear from the people, that were a part of the 23-day hunger strike. What was that experience like for you, and why was it crucial for you to continue empowering people to talk about their experiences? Because I remember the last time we spoke, that was something that was always important to you. So can you talk about why you wanted to continue that for this project?
Absolutely. So it's obviously, we were only able to interview a handful of people, but I want to mention that there were thousands of folks who, participated in this movement and continue to participate in this movement. So although there are a handful of people talking in the film and they were interviewed for the film, those are not the only people who participated and are keeping this movement alive. But I wanted to, pass the mic because who better knows this story than the people who participated in this, the people who didn't eat for 23 days, the people who, experienced further destabilization because of the pandemic. And so it was important for me because I'd rather, provide the space in terms of the privilege that I have. I want to use that privilege to open up the doors and to provide the spaces for, dialogue, for conversation, for catharsis, for learning, for unlearning, for memory. And again, it's important. Like this was a huge moment, and it is still such a huge moment, not just for New York City history, but for the history of the country. And so I wanted to, talk to people and ask them what it felt like being part of something so historic, because the hunger strike bill, the $2.1 billion bill that New York State passed in 2021, this bill, there's been nothing like it in terms of economic assistance for undocumented people throughout the United States, throughout the 50 states, right? So that's huge. And I wanted to, give people a moment to reflect on that. And the questions were very, they were open-ended. They were general, so people felt comfortable actually going into what they were, dealing with and things like this. I feel that often when it comes to Black and brown stories that are not told by the people, it's always about the struggle. It's always about the heaviness. It's always the tearjerker. But and like people, a lot of documentarians, like there's already such a history of exploitation within documentary, right? And so for that, I wanted to say, you know what? I'm going to ask you the most baseline questions, and from there, let's get into, however far you want to get into remembering this particular moment. And it was beautiful. The interviews were conducted in Spanish. Again, whether you're Latino, Caribbean, a Spanish speaker, if you speak Creole, if you speak Mandarin, like there's already such a stigma when it comes to immigrants and their proficiency with English, right? And so why further stigmatize the people if they could just speak the language that like I also speak? So, It was like those little things like here and there that that were important to me, and I'm really happy And I'm the happiest that the people who the huelguistas, the strikers and the organizers, I'm most happy because they love the film.
That's so amazing.
That's the biggest thing.
Now, I really want to talk about, you talked about reflection and you also mentioned your privilege. I want to talk about, you know, I think any movie that's good makes the person watching or a part of it reflect on their life or like who they are. And you said that it made you reflect on your life as a second generation Dominican American. Can you just talk a little bit more about that and what was going through your mind?
Yeah, so, you know, a lot of times we get so wrapped up, you know, as people who are born in the United States, we get very wrapped up in oppression, in, you know, I don't have this privilege and I want to fight for extra, you know, privileges or human rights that I deserve. And unfortunately, I feel that oftentimes conversations about race and conversations about privilege and conversations about equity really do exclude immigrants, because we are ready. And it was something that I had to, you know, grapple with when I was doing this film and when I ended up having to edit it, because I wasn't planning on doing that, but I ended up having to do that. So I'm sitting with the material for like hours and hours and hours and hours. But, you know, like it's important to realize that there is so much privilege, and this may be a controversial statement, but it shouldn't be because it's true. There's so much privilege that comes with an American passport. There's so much privilege that comes with a birth certificate. There's so much privilege that comes with a social security card, with an ID, with not having to worry about going outside because you're, you know, you have to be wary of police or of Homeland Security. The freedom to take a train, the freedom to take a plane, the freedom to travel. A lot of, you know, there are so many things that when I would think about myself in terms of the privileges that I have in this country and in this world, I'd always rush to say, I have no privileges as, you know, a Black, Indigenous, Latina, you know, Caribbean woman, second gen, whatever. I was very, you know, fast and quick to say, right, oh, I'm at the bottom of the barrel. And again, in some ways I am, but in terms of my community, I'm not. I have immense privilege. And I feel it's very important for us, especially as folks who are part of the immigrant community, whether your grandparents, you know, immigrated here, whether it was your great grandparents. I feel like it's important to understand that and to locate yourself, because if you are so in like the self-deprecating hole of I have no privilege, then, you know, you're kind of like turning the blind eye. Again, this is what I started to feel about myself and the way that I was moving in this world. I was ostracizing a community and kind of, you know, not necessarily thinking about my people and my relation to my people. And when I say my people, I mean like all immigrant New York, you know, it's the people. And so I just, you know, I feel like it's really important, especially if your work, well, no, it's important in general, but obviously if your work is centering a group of people that you are related to, but not directly a part of, but also if you're just, you know, a human in this world, walking in this world, living in this world, it's important to realize the privileges. It's important to realize the inequities, but, you know, using those privileges that you have to, you know, further uplift and amplify and just help out your fellow community. So.
Well, we're at the end of our segment. I want to thank you so much. Can you quickly just let everybody know how they can view Veintitires?
So I don't know yet. Okay. I am planning. So because it's done with the film festival circuit, I am planning on making the link public on Vimeo. But yes, it's going to be available on Vimeo in a public link, but it could also be found, or it will also be able to be found on my website as well.
All right, Djali, thank you so much for bringing this information.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday. Welcome back. We'd like to take this moment to highlight our BronxNet reporters and videographers who go out in the field to cover various Bronx events. Let's take a look. City Island residents gathered to support local artist Jordan Kelly and his digital art exhibition.
This is all Jordan. I mean, the art, the inspiration, the execution is all Jordan.
Managing to curate an entire art exhibition on his own, Kelly surprisingly says art wasn't always his passion. The young artist looks back at the moment he was inspired to join the world of digital art.
My first thing I got interested in art was when I went to the MoMA and I saw art for the first time. I wasn't always into art. I was more into music, but I slowly grew out of the music thing. I mean, I still played music, but I got more into art.
Inspired by what he saw, father of the artist Don Kelly details his thoughts on Jordan's work.
It's an inspiration, the choice of colors. He's always had a fascinating idea about colors since he was a child. And all of his paintings have exhibited something unique, different.
Accomplishing a milestone in his artistic career, Jordan Kelly ends the event offering advice for young aspiring artists.
I would say go for it. Like, let your dreams go true. Don't let anyone really hold you back from doing what you want to do. Like, if you want to dress a certain way, dress a certain way. If you want to be a certain way, be a certain way. Just be who you really are. Be true to yourself.
Reporting for BronxNet, Kibin Alleyne.
After a 2-year hiatus, New York City Celebrates Women is back for their 3rd annual brunch fundraiser, recognizing women entrepreneurs that are making it happen despite the shutdown of New York City's economy. And now they're here to support others on the same journey.
I'm really excited to be here at the Harmony Club on 60th Street in Manhattan. It's pretty she.
Hosting the event called Step by Step Women Entrepreneurs is BronxNet Open's Rina Valentin, who welcomed owners like designer Kibin Alleyne here with her daughter, Catherine Dordones.
The name is our brand is Callus Swingwear.
And featured panelists, executive coach, activist, and healer, Dr. Dayanara Marte, who came to support women in maintaining their vision and mission.
A lot of things happened during COVID that were really sad, but then there's also this amazing, this creativity that got sparked in people having to reinvent themselves.
We build software for governments to do better procurement.
And from Silicon Valley, Paola Santana, who is CEO of Glass, was the keynote speaker, encouraging women to own their roles as entrepreneurs.
I moved into Silicon Valley from Washington, D.C., not because I wanted to have these new titles, but because I wanted to do something different.
We are very excited to have women from different sectors that are doing amazing work in our community.
That's Natalie Tejada, joined by co-founders Eliana Cruz and Jeannie Pimentel, all celebrating women like Texas native Tony Grant, who is founder and CEO of House of Swag. She talked about what things look like for her online retail company at the start of the pandemic.
The first thing that goes as far as finances when you have a bad economy is people thinking, well, I don't need clothes, I don't need accessories. So we've really ramped up our creative efforts and our creative ideas to flourish.
Other honorees shared their journey to fill a gap in the marketplace.
I was born in Bangladesh, a small country next to India, and sex education is not a part of our everyday lives. This is the first sex education website that's created entirely in Bangla. Since I released the website in 2021, we've had more than 40,000 views, which means that there is an interest.
What I've created is a place where different nonprofit organizations, different people can get content, create content by us, for us.
And there to share in all of their journeys was business area consultant Jamoke Fagbayi Butts.
We are very committed to minority entrepreneurs, particularly women-owned businesses, and really excited to be here today supporting everyone.
So the conversations happening here are about helping women entrepreneurs, whether it's starting out or establishing their business. It's something this organization wants to see happen each year. Here at Harmony Club, Arlene Makoko for BronxNet.
You may look around and think to yourself, is it Mother's Day? No, it's the Bronx Birthing Center Womb Bus launch on wheels. The Womb Bus is a new addition to the fight to better Bronx health. This bus focus is on our soon-to-be and current mothers.
Womb Bus is our vehicle to reach our families and community as soon as we possibly can. As we know, New York is really lagging behind most states in our country when it comes to having access to birth center care. And while we are working on learning what the regulations are for the birth centers that will come to New York, we knew that New York might drag its feet or have other focuses, priorities, the the range, but we really wanted to do what we can to reach our community now. So Woombus is a mobile wellness hub that is offering education, resources, and offerings that have a range of programs.
State Senator Gustavo Rivera joins the ladies in celebration of the launch.
Well, I'm here today partnering up with the Bronx Birthing Center to kind of, in the last couple of months, this womb bus has been making its visit to different parks across the city, and right here in St. James Park, it's been coming for the last 6 weeks. And this is an effort from the Bronx Birthing Center to be able to bring services directly to birthing people all over the Bronx. And it's part of their continued efforts. We've been working with them. My office has been working with them for many years on issues around motherhood.
Of course, any organization isn't strong unless it has strong women behind the scenes.
As a woman and as a black woman specifically, we are the most at risk for not having positive outcomes in our birth. And just being listened to as a person who births in a medical industrial complex. And so it is extremely important for folks to have access to resources, to know that they have choices, to have somewhere where they can receive information and support, and really set themselves up to have the best birthing experience that they could possibly have.
Just wanted to introduce one of our community collaborators. Her name is Ivana Morgan, and like I said before, we have a bunch of collaborators that work with the Womb Bus, and she was here yesterday as we supported a community at Metropolitan Oval.
I did a little talk on postpartum care and how acupuncture can help with trying to help relax the body, keep postpartum women and birthing people relaxed and well cared for and supported after they have their baby. It's a very important time that we don't really get to talk about and we don't really get to put a lot of time in, but it's a very important time for people who've given birth to regain their lost resources, rest, re-energize so that they can better take care of the baby.
The hope is that this bus will find its way to better the lives of Bronx moms. For BronxNet, this is Kyrie Moody.
The old adage, time flies, couldn't be more true because Charlie's Bar and Kitchen has been knocking them back for 10 years. Whether that's putting steaks in plates or wedding whistles, Charlie's has remained a staple in the Bronx, with the bar's name serving as a tribute to all those famous Charlies out there, from Charlie Chaplin to Charlie Brown.
If you came to Mott Haven, you came to Charlie's, you came to vibe out to Mott Haven Bar and Grill, and I'm here to celebrate 10 years, which is an amazing accomplishment. Community, you know what I mean? When you come in here, you feel it, you taste it, and it's a beautiful thing to be around that, All the people here that work are like family. They know what you want, they know your usual. That's what I have to say about this section right here is community, togetherness, family, friends, and it's a beautiful thing.
It's been a long road for Charlie's Bar and Kitchen, and after just celebrating their 10-year anniversary, the establishment is taking it one step at a time. So until the place hits its next anniversary, customers will have to take one more for the road. Reporting from Lincoln Avenue, I'm Noah Osborne.
The Crotona Park Jam Series is back in action. The jam includes a host of well-known DJs spinning and elect officials who represent the Bronx.
This organization has been doing this, and particularly for the last 19 years, without incident. Everyone that you see here is hip-hop royalty. This is the birthplace of hip-hop. Tonight we have DJ Red Alert. Grandmaster Kaz is our unofficial MC for the 4 weeks that we're here. And this is hip-hop royalty, and they come here for free. So we are doing this for the community. We get public and private funding, and this is what we want to give to our community. A remembrance of where hip-hop comes from, where it's going.
Councilmember Althea Stevens and Assemblywoman Chantel Jackson were participants of the jam and shared the messages from the jam to the surrounding communities.
As a community member, I'm just enjoying it. I know that I represent this park. Crotona Park is my life and my heart. But just to be able to come out here and see children out here and get to hear music that they probably wouldn't hear on a regular basis just makes me feel so good on the inside. It's so heartwarming to see families and friends out here dancing and enjoying everything.
This event is so amazing. As you guys can see, the community's coming out, having a good time. It's peaceful. A lot of people come back who left the community, come back to hang out and see people. And so I'm happy that I was able to sponsor this. This is my first time in council. It is extremely important that we have events like this where we're bridging the gaps between generations, because as you guys can see, it's a multi-generational event where we have young people out here, we have older adults out here. So it's extremely important that we continue this and continue the legacy of hip hop in the Bronx. And so as you see, we have legends out here, so it's so important for us to keep this and really embrace our history and culture.
In case you missed the jam, you're in luck. The Katona Park Jams happen every Thursday in the month of July from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. at the Katona Park Amphitheater. For BronxNet, this is Kyrie Moody.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday. Welcome back. In 2020, a then 15-year-old Piper Lewis killed her alleged rapist. A victim of human trafficking and multiple attacks, Lewis pleaded guilty to the killing of Zachary Brooks. Now she's ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution in accordance with Iowa law. Joining me to discuss this ruling and the impact it could have on sexual abuse survivors is the executive director of the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault, Emily Miles. Emily, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this is a tragic story about a very young woman or young girl. Can you tell me what you know about Piper Lewis's story?
Absolutely. So Piper Lewis, as you said, is the Black Iowa 15-year-old who ran away from an abusive home and after being found sleeping in a hallway of an apartment building was taken in by a 28-year-old man who subsequently repeatedly trafficked her. One of those men was a man named Zachary Brooks, who was 37 years old. He repeatedly raped Piper over the course of weeks. And on the final night, she was forced at knife point by her trafficker to once again go with Zachary Brooks. After she was repeatedly raped yet again, she took a knife from the bedside table and stabbed Brooks multiple times, killing him. Despite Piper being a child and a rape victim, she was actually charged as an adult with first-degree murder, though it was pled down to lesser charges. And she was sentenced in September to 5 years probation, community service, and to pay $150,000 to the family of her rapist, as is required by Iowa law.
So you mentioned that, the $150,000, it was a little bit less than what she was initially given. But, what were your initial thoughts, regarding this ruling?
Yeah, I mean, I think I and many others who around the country were really appalled by this ruling. When delivering the sentence, the judge noted that his hands were tied regarding forcing Piper to pay the $150,000 in restitution. But, luckily, people across the country have come together with a GoFundMe that should hopefully help pay this off for her. There are still some questions about that, but the hope is that it will help her as they've currently raised enough to cover the $150,000 and to assist Piper a bit in her recovery. But I think many people find this incredibly concerning, especially because Piper Lewis is a child, and it's especially troubling to apply restitution requirement to a minor, especially one who had survived such a horrific crime herself.
Now, Judge David Porter also ruled that Lewis would receive 5 years probation and serve 200 hours of community service, plus more than $4,000 in civil penalties. According to CNN, the deferred judgment means that this may be expunged from Lewis's record. Will the possibility of having all this removed from her record help her at all in the future?
Yes, of course, it's really critical that this judgment is ultimately expunged from her record, but we can't lose sight of the reality that she should never have been charged or put in this position in the first place. In order to actually get the expungement, she must uphold very strict terms of her probation over the course of 5 years. And it's important to underscore the reality of what supervised probation is. It's incredibly restrictive, and her ability to conform perfectly to the rules in front of her, if she's ever found in violation of those, she could then be imprisoned in accordance to the 20-year sentencing guidelines. Remember, this is a child who has survived a tremendous amount of trauma. Trauma presents itself in a number of ways, especially for youth. So there are many that are concerned that Piper might not be able to adhere to every element of this strict supervision, and then are concerned about what will happen to her as a result. I think it also must be said that the impact of Piper being a young Black child cannot be understated. There are many, and me included, who believe that if Piper were a young white 15-year-old, these charges would never have been brought in the first place.
Now, can you, I'm really glad that you brought that up. Can you just talk about, because a lot of people don't want to talk about it, or, just assume that, obviously people who are victims of this, all deserve to be heard and listened to. But can you talk about, how her experience may differ as she go on throughout life? And you also mentioned that because she's a kid, it is probably going to be very hard for her to kind of deal with those consequences, and she could possibly end up back in prison. All of that stuff combined, can you just talk about, what that means for her and the impact it'll have?
Absolutely. Piper is a child, and whenever anyone experiences high level of trauma, like the trauma of trafficking and repeated rape, that trauma will present itself across the life course in a variety of different ways. That's especially true for youth who are still learning coping mechanisms and ways to work through this trauma in the long run. Something else that must be said is that Piper was actually adopted. She was adopted at 3 years old by a family that reportedly was incredibly emotionally abusive as she was growing up as well. So these are compounded traumas in Piper's life that we hope is that over the course of the upcoming years, she will be connected with quality mental health treatment that will give her some of the skills to help work through this trauma. Unfortunately, that type of quality treatment can be difficult to come by, especially for survivors of sexual assault.
Now, can you talk about how our society seemingly punishes victims or survivors of sexual assault and abuse?
Yes, regarding this case in particular, it's important to point out that if Piper had been living in many other states, she would rightfully have been seen as a victim under the law, and this legal case against her may have played out very differently. Iowa is one of a minority of states that doesn't have something called a safe harbor law. So in safe harbor states, minors who are involved in sex trafficking are seen as victims, and they are connected to social services and advocates instead of being charged with crimes. Now, it's also good to know that New York is actually one of the first states in the country to enact this type of law. So we are a safe harbor state. So while the safe harbor laws would not have kept Piper from being charged with homicide, some question whether it would have caused her to be treated at the outset as a victim of sexual exploitation, and if her actions then would have been viewed through a different lens, and therefore her case may have proceeded differently. Zachary Brooks raped Piper Lewis, a child, repeatedly. Law enforcement and the prosecution don't deny this. Everyone accepts that to be true. And yet she was still charged with first-degree murder and is being forced to pay restitution to his family. I think it's also important to note here that Piper's trafficker has yet to be charged with any crime.
Wow, that's really disappointing to hear. Now, I want to know, like, is this the first time that you've seen a case like this with a similar outcome? I know prior I've seen like a story online about a girl named Cyntoia Brown, I believe, where she was also punished for retaliating against, her abuser. Can you just talk a little bit more about like why we're seeing this pattern, or is it something that you've seen often?
Yeah. No, unfortunately, this is not the only case where this happens. We see cases across the country where teenagers who are survivors of trafficking and rape are prosecuted and have spent time in prison, sometimes for up to half their lives, for the murder of their rapists and traffickers. Again, it is far more likely in these cases that the teens that are then prosecuted in this way tend to come from communities of color. You mentioned Cyntoia Brown. She spent 15 years in prison for killing a man who paid for sex while she was 16 years old. She wasn't released until 2019 after advocates came to her assistance in the wake of the Me Too movement. So her sentence was then commuted and she was released. And she's actually now an advocate for other teens who have been put in these types of positions. But again, it's really important to note that victims that are frequently treated in this way are and have killed their abusers are often victims of color.
Now, Lewis was a very, very vulnerable young person who, like, as we mentioned, is a victim of human trafficking. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the statistics regarding teenagers and sexual assault or abuse?
Absolutely. So according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, so the CDC, 1 in 4 women have experienced rape in their lifetime, with more than 80% reporting their first victimization occurring before the age of 25, 49% before the age of 18. 1 in 2 women report unwanted sexual contact in their lifetime, and 80% of those victims report that happening before the age of 25. So while sexual assault impacts everyone, no matter age, race, gender, or sexual orientation, the numbers make it very clear that first instances of victimization are far more likely to occur among young women or those who identify as women under the age of 25, and especially under the age of 18. And I personally find that to be a chilling statistic. I think it's also important to state that we as a society, we're never going to incarcerate our way out of numbers like this. The only way that we as a community will fundamentally change these numbers is through a deeper investment in sexual violence prevention initiatives that stop violence before it even begins.
And I'd also like to know your thoughts on, because you mentioned earlier that the person who trafficked Piper still has not, received any consequences. Should our justice system be doing a little bit more in regard to that? Because, clearly they found her guilty of something, but the person who put her in that situation is still possibly walking free. Can you just talk about how our justice system needs to do a little bit better in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there's not a lot of information about the trafficker. In fact, this person hasn't yet even been publicly identified. And so there are a lot of questions about what's happening in that part of the case. That said, there are a number of things that our criminal justice system can do better in order to support survivors. One, treating every survivor in a trauma-informed way. Understanding the impact that sexual assault can have on a survivor, and especially understanding, kind of getting rid of this idea of the myth of the perfect victim. Frequently our criminal justice system will not prosecute or take seriously survivors who come from certain communities of color, immigrant communities, LGBTQ+ communities, homeless communities, sex workers, All of these individuals can be survivors of sexual assault and frequently are not taken seriously by the system and therefore never receive the services that are required for them to heal.
All right, Emily, thank you so much for joining me and talking about this.
Absolutely.
That's all for our show today. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.